What I'd like to show you guys is how to set up a basic spreadsheet in Excel that does calculations for average, average deviation, and standard deviation. And then you guys, once you have a generic setup, you can just change, some of the letters and add rows or whatever you need to for each lab. Open up an Excel file in your computer, and you can start in any column you want. I started in column B. It leaves me a little room on the left side in column A to write stuff. And go along and enter your time data. So if you want, just to make sure you're on the same page as me, follow along and enter the first one, 5.40. The second one is 4.30. The next one is 5.70. Then 4.80, 6.00, 5.90, 6.20, 4.90. Once your data points are entered, it's time to add them up and take the average. What I've done here is I manually typed it in. I added up, this is column B that we're in, I added up the information from B4 all the way to B11. So I went equals sum, parentheses, B4, colon, B11, close the parentheses, and because there's 8 data points, I divide, so use the division bar, by 8. To set up my deviation column, this is what I did. I typed in the title of the column, which is the absolute value of time, that's T from over here, minus the average time, which is right down here, this 5.40, which is my average. So it's time minus the average time, and I take the absolute value, because if I don't take the absolute value, when I sum all these up to get the average deviation, it'll say 0, and that's not correct. Some points are above the average, some are below the average, so the average deviation has to be the sum of the absolute value. So how do I know that? Well, first I do this. I double click on the top cell that's in column C, row 4. See that? Column C, row 4. All right? And I type in equals ABS, that's absolute value, parentheses, B4, right? That's one of my data points, B4, minus. Now, we always want it to divide by the average downhill, this 5.40. So rather than type 5.40 by hand, I have it refer always to this cell. So if I want to go in and insert more data later, I can click on a column, I can add data or whatever I want to do. If I want to add more data later, I keep the functions exactly the same, and this becomes a generic kind of a template that you can use for every lab. So how do I get it to refer to this bottom cell, 5.40, all the time? Well, that's cell B12. So I put $B, $12, and that says no matter what I do, keep that exactly the same cell. And then close the parentheses here. Can you see that? Close parentheses and hit return. Now that doesn't fill out the rest of the columns. They were originally empty like this. So let me empty them to show you how you do this. Some of you may be familiar with the click and drag method. Click on the cell. I want to copy this formula in all the cells below to fill them out. So I go up here till I see a plus in the corner. I click, that's a left click, and I drag it down. And that's going to move my formula down and ta-da, calculate it for me and fill that out. And what it's done is this. When it went to C5, that's the next row, it typed in, okay, take the absolute value of B5, that's the data in row B5, and divide it or subtract from that $B, $12. So it moved down to the next row, B5, but it didn't change my reference number, $B, $12. In other words, I want to subtract all of these numbers, I want to subtract the average from them. So when I go to the next one, it's going to be absolute B6 minus $B, $12. The next one's going to be absolute B7 minus $, and so on. So by putting in the $, and dragging and clicking, it's automatically carried the formula through. Now, how do I get average deviation down here? Some of you are saying, well, that's simple. I want to take the sum of C4 to C11, just add all the numbers in between and divide by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so when I click on here, it says equals sum, parentheses, C4, colon, C11, divided by 8. And that's it. Piece of cake, right? So next, we'll go to the column for standard deviation. Now, Excel will figure out standard deviation for you, so you don't even have to put a formula in or anything else, but I always do. That's just my general rule of thumb. I like to actually see the numbers to see that somebody knows what they're doing and isn't just clicking on a bunch of stuff mindlessly and assuming that it's the right answer. So for standard deviation, first of all, we take this absolute value of t minus the average time. We square that. So I'm going to do all that first because standard deviation will be the square root of this number divided by n minus 1, right? So it'll be this number over n minus 1. N in this case is 8 because there's 8 data points. N minus 1 would be 7, so we're going to divide by 7 when we get to that. So all I'm doing here in this column is simply squaring the value for the deviation. So if you look here, what you'll see is I refer to C4. That's this one right here. Okay? And I use a little caret. See this little thing right here? That tells it to the second power. And the caret is Shift 6 on your keyboard. So I go equals C4 Shift 6. That gives me the caret. 2, and that tells me squared. So then in your spreadsheet, it's going to look like this. You're not going to have the rest of the column filled out. So what you do is you click like this, highlight the corner, and drag down. Ta-da! And that gives you the square of all your deviations right there. Okay? So far, so good. Now, you can do standard deviation all in one step. I prefer to go ahead and total all this stuff at first. So down here at the bottom, I just simply add these numbers. It makes typing in the formula for standard deviation easier. So equals sum D4 colon D11, right? And that's it. I'm not going to divide by 8 because I don't want an average of that. I'm going to divide by 7, that's n minus 1, and then I'll take the square root in the next column for standard deviation. The last thing we have to do is calculate the standard deviation, and the calculation for it's going to be really easy because we've already calculated our total here. So here's the formula. I take D12, that's this cell right here, which is the sum of the squares of all the errors, divided by n minus 1, in this case 7, and I take the square root. So you notice I use the little caret, the little up sign, Shift 6, because that's the power of 0.5, right? So that's to the 0.5 power, or the 1/2 power. And then that automatically calculates it for me. So that's parentheses D12 divided by n minus 1, which is 7, and then to the 0.5 or 1/2 power. Don't forget the equals at the beginning either.